Now, as I mentioned, the UK is facing the extension of hate crime legislation to include the charge of misogyny. In line with current hate crime legislation, the charge will require no evidence of hateful motivations, but rather be governed by the perception of the victim or any witnesses. This shameful waste of police time will offer another avenue for malicious women to use the law to harm innocent men, as well as diverting precious resources from the fight against actual crime. And don't think that these crimes won't be acted upon by sensible officers. A perception of indifference from the police in such circumstances will be treated, as it is with current hate crimes, as secondary victimisation, with Greater Manchester Police clarifying that action will be taken against police accused of indifference towards victims, and whether or not it is reasonable for them to perceive it that way is immaterial. End quote. Family courts have been infested with feminist ideology too, resulting in fathers routinely being cast out of their homes and having their relationships with their children destroyed, even whilst being held responsible for their financial requirements. Then there is the gender justice gap for those convicted of crimes, which we'll hear more about from Jordan Holbrook tomorrow. Sex discrimination in the UK criminal justice system has a long history. For example, flogging as a punishment for female criminals was banned in 1820, but continued for men until 1967. Presently, men account for around 95% of the total prison population, despite only committing 3.4 times more crimes than women. Factors that explain this disparity include a greater percentage of convicted men being sentenced to prison, men being given longer sentences on average than women, women being paroled earlier than men, despite being more likely to be disciplined for bad behaviour whilst incarcerated, and women being more likely to have mitigating factors such as age, dependence, lack of previous relevant convictions, and the appearance of genuine remorse applied to their sentences. Feminist activists such as Women in Prisons, Baroness Corston, and Julie Bindel have committed themselves to widening the gender justice gap enabled by myopic and sentimental authorities. Feminism is a threat to meritocracy. The cultural obsession with the gender pay gap is driven by disingenuous, authoritarian feminists with no regard for personal choice, meritocracy, or human well-being. The focus is exclusively on the mythical glass ceiling, with no interest paid to the fate of those men employed in the glass cellar, dangerous and dirty jobs that women don't want, who are increasingly at risk of unemployment due to automation, as well as the ever-present risks of workplace injury and death. Quotas are being used by many organisations which discriminate against men, sometimes Caucasian men specifically. This is not only immoral in that it unfairly disadvantages individuals, but also frankly stupid, with the potential to impair the functioning of sectors rejecting meritocracy and therefore the economy and society in general. Battles are being fought to acquire equal pay for women performing similar or even sometimes dissimilar roles to their male counterparts, regardless of relevant facts such as whether they work fewer hours. For example, the BBC's former China editor, Carrie Gracie, was awarded £280,000 in back pay to bring her earnings in line with John Sowell, the North America editor, despite the fact that his job was more intensive and he was on air significantly more than her. She's donated her payout to the Fawcett Society. There are also several battles raging to secure equal pay for mainly female supermarket store workers as mainly male warehouse workers. An Asda spokesman clarified, in response to coverage consistently suggesting otherwise, that at Asda, hourly paid colleagues doing the same job in the same location are paid the same. Men and women doing the same job in our retail stores are paid the same. Men and women doing the same job in our distribution centres are paid the same. Pay rates in stores differ from pay rates in distribution centres for legitimate reasons." End quote. Differences in comfort, exertion and safety in the roles have been labelled as entirely illegitimate reasons to offer different levels of pay to workers in the coverage of the stories. Unfortunately, the courts look likely to agree. Feminism is a threat to men. Feminism attacks male-only spaces and male interests. Traditionally, male and female-only spaces have existed as the norm in every culture. Men hunted together, explored together, and enjoyed ritual space that allowed men and fathers and sons to bond. Later, they would create numerous social clubs and guilds. During the last 30 years, though, a monumental shift has happened, which has seen doors to venues that offer male space nailed shut or rendered strictly unisex, thanks to equalities legislations that feminists have worked so hard to institute, and which are conspicuously only ever applied to male space, never female space. It's now literally illegal for men to formally gather alone, a behaviour classed as oppressive to women. This mean and bitter assault on freedom of association is surely a barrier in the way of some men finding intimate and supportive networks of like-minded peers who could share experiences, have one another's backs, and express themselves freely. And that's probably why it's so important to the feminist project. Feminists have colonised and at least attempted to lobotomise video games, comics, rock music, action films, even Lads Mag Loaded, which closed down a year after they decided to be far more discerning and sophisticated in their depiction of women. Lad culture comes under sustained criticism, with the National Union of Students producing a report called That's What She Said, based on interviews with a whole 40 women. It cited negative attitudes towards feminism as being among the problematic behaviour associated with lads on campus, and sports and other extracurricular activities as being key sites where such behaviour arose. The report acknowledged that policy frameworks to tackle lad culture have had no impact on sexual assault rates where they've been pursued in US universities, and goes on to suggest policy frameworks to tackle lad culture in UK universities, apparently simply because they don't like it. Feminism attacks male behaviour and masculinity. Regardless of whether a behaviour is innocuous or women engage in equivalent or even the same behaviour, if a man does anything, feminists oppose it. In the last few years, catchy feminist portmanteaus such as manspreading, mansplaining and manterrupting have proliferated and become ubiquitous in their use. The aim is to shame, silence and bludgeon men into compliance. Masculinity as a whole is vilified and demonised in our societies. The endeavour begins at school, intensifies at university and in the workplace increasingly, and reaches a tragic crescendo in family courts, where men are denied access to their children, who would bring such critically important meaning to their lives and be the ultimate expression of their masculinity. Feminism is a very direct threat to men's literal freedom, as I've already discussed. But the current state of affairs is not enough for some feminists who want to see men not guilty till proven innocent, but guilty upon accusation. Julie Lalonde, an expert brought into Ottawa University during the hysteria around a rape allegation that proved false to tackle the institution's rape culture, believes that every time we see a high-profile sexual assault trial result in an acquittal, it sends women back 50 years. Feminism is a threat to women. Feminists seek to dictate women's behaviour. They objectify women by rejecting their autonomy and deny them respect. Tolerance is a noble attitude to take that's consistent with living in a diverse and pluralist society, but the feminist preachers of tolerance exercise very little. They attack women who reject the feminist label and those who make the wrong choices, to be a cam girl, a stay-at-home mother, or a conservative, for example. Even those who do identify as feminist but challenge mainstream feminist dogma. And feminism threatens its own female true believers. If you can convince a woman that she's disadvantaged, you make her so.
In the past few days, Apple, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, and other companies have all banned Alex Jones from using their platforms. Also, Twitter purged various libertarian accounts. Instagram temporarily banned Tommy Robinson. Facebook took down a GOP candidate's ads for allegedly being offensive. And Democratic Senator Chris Murphy says mass censorship is needed to ensure, quote, the survival of the democracy, end quote.
Well, Twitter has long denied that it is biased against conservative accounts. That's obviously a lie. It's always obviously been a lie, and now it is a proven lie. A new report by Vice found that the Republican lawmakers on the conservative accounts wouldn't show up in the search bar when users searched for them. That is censorship, obviously, and it was intentional. Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida was one of those conservatives shadow banned by Twitter. He just filed a complaint against the company with the Federal Election Commission. Congressman Gaetz joins us tonight. Congressman, thank you for coming on. So I guess the first is a factual question. You're certain that this happened to you and it was intentional?
Well, I'm certain that there were only 4 members of Congress who had their voices suppressed on Twitter: Matt Gaetz, Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, and Devin Nunes. So that'd be one hell of a coincidence. My suspicion is that if people were effectively communicating a conservative message, they got caught in Twitter's troll trap. The reason that I think that that is illegal is because that it gives advantages to our political opponents. It gives them access to the platform that we don't have. If Twitter was a billboard company and they gave Democrats access to their billboards and not Republicans, that would be an illegal corporate donation to the campaigns of Democrats. Here, instead of the billboard, it's the auto fill-in function as a part of Twitter's search feature that wasn't available to me, Devin Nunes, Mark Meadows, or Jim Jordan, and it's available to Democrats.
We generally don't trust governments to make decisions about the kinds of opinions that ought to be aired, or what things are false and what things are true. Why would we possibly trust Silicon Valley executives who have even less accountability and less transparency, no democratic accountability, in fact, to make those decisions on these platforms that have, for better or worse, become our public squares? I think it's incredibly dangerous. And if we think that it's only going to be used in ways that we like, just look at the history of censorship. That's never how it works.
You believe that the FEC can remedy this?
They absolutely can institute fines, just like they could institute fines and punishment against any company that illegally makes a corporate donation to a political campaign. Here, the corporate donation is allowing Democrats and the people running against me specifically to have access to elements of the search feature that I didn't have access to. And why, Tucker? Why? Twitter has said in their official response that it was my behavior that resulted in this. I don't know what behavior that is. So are we really going to trust tech companies to be able to just decide with no transparency what behavior limits someone's ability to amplify their message? That sounds like the Tech Tyranny series you did a couple months ago is coming to life before our very eyes.
Well, it clearly is. And Twitter is a fairly small player in this world. It's a failing company anyway. Google dominates all of tech. And in fact, it's the portal through which almost all human information flows. So if Google were to hold things back in search or put its thumb on the scale in any way, they could have a huge effect on our society.
Did you know that Google got started thanks to a program run by the US government? Google wouldn't exist if it wasn't for American taxpayers.
Congress exists to make sure that the public interest is represented, and yet I've never heard a member of Congress say, we're going to get to the bottom of this, we're going to break up Google, we're going to fulfill our oversight role here. Why not?
Well, frankly, too many members of Congress just don't understand the gravity of the issue. But now we're the ones that have the targets drawn on our foreheads. And so I think that you'll see more engagement from the Congress coming forward. A reasonable libertarian might ask, why shouldn't I just leave Twitter? Why should I have excessive government regulation? And it's important to recognize Twitter and other social media companies use the federal government to get rid of lawsuits that they don't want to have to defend against. And they use a provision that requires them to hold themselves out as a neutral public public forum. So Twitter and Facebook can't say on one hand, we're neutral and thus we shouldn't have to respond to lawsuits, and then on the other hand, tell me and other outspoken conservatives that our behavior results in suppression on their platform. Right. They can't have it both ways.
Mark Zuckerberg has always claimed that Facebook was a platform for all ideas. Fine. You know, in doing that, he says, I'm not a publisher, I'm just a means of people putting out their messages. You know, whatever you think of Alex Jones and InfoWars, and you know, you may say, hey, this guy's a bit out there. The point is, he's got a big following, he has an opinion, and if you believe in free speech, if you believe in your First Amendment rights, people should be allowed to do this. I would say that by banning Jones, by shadow banning many others, Facebook and others are now effectively becoming a publisher, and that means, because they're taking editorial decisions, they should be open to being sued as other media organizations are.
For conservatives in general, there's this dogma that says that government has no business telling private companies what they can and can't do, what ideas they have to associate themselves with. We just had a big debate over, for example, whether a bakery can be forced to make a cake in commemoration of a ceremony that the owners of that business find personally offensive for religious reasons. But the only exception to that, I think, on sort of by consensus, is when a company becomes more than just a company. They have monopolistic power. And in the case of companies like Google and Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg said a few years ago, we're basically like a government. We make our own laws that govern our community. 2 billion people use Facebook. And when you look at what these companies control, it's not just widgets, right? It's data about us and the flow of news and information and debate. To vest companies with this kind of power that's essentially limitless, with limitless control to do whatever they want, to do it in secret, to have secret algorithms that control what we see and what we don't see, is a serious menace to our democracy. And I think whether you're a free market conservative or kind of a leftist or a liberal, nobody should like companies like this having monopolistic power greater than the governments of nation states, which is what they have.
Let me suggest, though, that some of the argument by Twitter and what they're doing is they're saying that these comments violate their standards. And if we open it up to, let's say, lawsuits for libel, wouldn't it make it even more difficult to have speech? Wouldn't more people be banned? Wouldn't there be more people suspended?
No, because if you're a platform for all ideas, you are not a publisher. That is the point. And what Zuckerberg and the other tech giants are trying to do is they're now trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, they claim, you know, we're not publishers, we're not open to libel because we let everybody give their opinion. But on the other, they now, in a very sinister way, are starting to ban and shadow ban.
What these social media platforms have done is they have absolutely, with their digital advertising, sucked the life out of traditional journalism, so that, you know, the traditional journalism outlets are on their last legs. They're teetering into extinction. And they're the places where they actually can get sued. If they do defamation, if they publish libel, they can be held liable, but these other platforms cannot. So between their market power, which I think is something that the DOJ should look at with antitrust regulation, and with their, frankly, false advertising to being open to everybody, which Twitter promises, Facebook promises, and you know, YouTube to a certain degree promises, although they don't pretend to do that anymore.
Take, for example, on Facebook, PragerU, an organisation that I've spoken for. I've been to their events. You know, these are not.
They do great work.
They do amazing work.
Yeah.
I mean, their videos have been seen by tens of millions of people. They now, on Facebook, have 88 of their videos that are now very much put to the back of the list. They're very hard to access, including ones on Christianity, for goodness sake.
Yeah. You have Facebook censoring Elizabeth Heng's ads when the incumbent's not censored. That is, to me, virtually an in-kind contribution by the platform to one side over the other. We can't have that in our system under our current laws. I'm not saying new laws. I'm just saying apply the current laws to the situation.
Google once said its mission was to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. Its motto was, don't be evil. But now they floated off in a giant balloon of arrogance, untethered to any notions of loyalty or ethics. Google is helping America's #1 enemy, the evil communist dictatorship in China, to oppress its own people through censorship, literally the exact opposite of what Google once stood for. Remember, too, that Google has built an artificial intelligence center in Beijing. even though the Chinese regime is openly saying it will use artificial intelligence to achieve military and economic dominance over America. On top of that, Google recently pulled out of helping our own Defense Department with artificial intelligence. So Google, born of a US government program, won't work with our government to defend democracy, but is falling over itself to work with the world's worst despots to crush democracy. I know the word treason is thrown around too much these days, but that seems like a pretty good definition of it to me.
What is needed now is a Bill of Rights for people using the internet. Let's give people access, let's give people rights, and if we can't get that, let's make sure we now redefine Facebook, YouTube and Twitter as publishers who are liable, as are Fox News or the Wall Street Journal or anybody else, to the content they put out.
Civil disobedience is a serious thing. The rule of law is the foundation of civilization. You shouldn't go around breaking the law knowingly unless you have a really good reason to do it. And I spend 5 chapters opening the book in which I make that case. And they go like this. The Constitution is broken beyond repair. Doesn't make any difference if we get 9 Clarence Thomases on the Supreme Court or 9 Nino Scalias, because their hands are tied by a very untouchable constraint. Namely, if they were to try to reverse the decisions of 1938 to 1943 that fundamentally changed the interpretation of key phrases in the Constitution, general welfare, the Commerce Clause, the rules under which the regulatory state can make up regulations. If they tried to change those, 90% of what the federal government does today would suddenly be unconstitutional. No Supreme Court can do that. It would never be enforced by a president. It would be the end of the Supreme Court. Second chapter, we live under an increasingly lawless legal system. I don't use the word lawless carelessly. At ground level, where we actually live from day to day, all sorts of things that go on do not correspond to our common sense notions of the rule of law, an objective set of things that reasonable people agree we must do. Rather, it corresponds to a complex game that bears little resemblance to the rule of law traditionally construed. Third chapter is the extra-legal nature of the entire regulatory state. I bet a lot of people in this room are as ignorant as I was when I started the book. I was amazingly ignorant about how the regulatory state works. It essentially is as if the police force were empowered to create laws and then to enforce them and to pick the judges and to pick the Court of Appeals. I mean, that's pretty much the way the regulatory state operates, and they make up these regulations independently of any specific mandate from Congress, except we want fair regulations. We want clean air. We want clean water. Fourth chapter, the systemic corruption of the federal government. Not that we have more dishonest legislators than we used to have. But if you look at operationally the way Washington goes about its business, it is indistinguishable from the way a kleptocracy operates. Strong statement. I'll leave it there. Basically, in the first 5 chapters, I'm saying there is no hope of rolling back government through the normal political process. You can get better policies on education. You can get better policies on tax policy, on discrete policy issues. You can't roll things back. So that's when I get to the point of the whole book. Let's have systematic civil disobedience. Let me tell you how the book came to be written, because it's a good illustration of what animated me. My wife and I have a friend who runs a business. I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. The point is, he was being harassed by the regulatory state and fined large amounts of money because he was not complying with various regulations that it was impossible for him to comply with. He was being given competing instructions from the government, and he finally said, I'm going to fight this in court. And the bureaucrat to whom he was talking said, try that and we will put you out of business. Well, when I heard that, as my wife will testify, I was so angry that I actually told her I don't want to hear any more of this because I just can't stand it. And then all at once, I had first an image in my mind. I'm not making this up. This really happened. I had an image. I think he was on a horse in my original image. A guy in a pinstripe suit and a horse comes out of nowhere, taps the bureaucrat in the shoulder and says, we are taking this man's case. We are going to litigate it to the max, even though he's technically guilty of the violation. But in the course of you having to demonstrate that, you are going to wish you'd never taken this on, because we're also going to publicize it in ways which will embarrass your superiors and you. And at the end of the whole thing, when you finally levy a fine on him, we're going to reimburse it. This satisfied me a great deal, just thinking of this. And then I said, you can write a book. And so ultimately I ended up writing this book as a way of saying we could systematically do this. If you had a foundation with a couple of $100 million, I'm not talking a little foundation, a place like Institute for Justice or the Pacific Legal Foundation or Competitive Enterprise do wonderful work in litigation, but they are doing selective cases where they are trying to have precedents that affect whole classes of cases. I'm talking about pouring sugar into the government's gas tank. I want to overload the regulatory enforcement apparatus, and I will simply assert right now that apparatus is not nearly as daunting as you think it is. It's daunting when it's directed against a single citizen. It's not an apparatus that can cope with a whole lot of challenges to it. The only way the regulatory state works is by getting overwhelmingly voluntary compliance, so that when the regulatory agency says you are in violation of such and such, you owe us $7,500, any smart business person or smart homeowner writes a check, knowing that they can't afford to fight it. And I want to create incentives whereby the regulatory state must back off. And I will summarize that in terms of an analogy. Right now, with regard to the regulatory state, we are in the position of somebody driving along the highway at 71 miles an hour when the speed limit is 65, and it's late at night and it's a deserted stretch of highway. We can easily get stopped by a state trooper doing that. You know, he may be bored, he may have his quota of tickets to fill, and he'll do it. The very next morning, as we're driving along a busy stretch of the interstate at 71 miles an hour, 6 miles over the speed limit, you're not going to get stopped because the whole flow of traffic is going 71 miles an hour. The troopers only stop people who are driving crazy fast, which occasionally is me, but they only stop you when you're driving crazy fast or you're driving erratically, and they enforce the law when something really, truly bad has happened. That's the way I want the regulatory state to function. I want them to adopt a no harm, no foul regulatory philosophy whereby they only go after people who've actually done something that's wrong in some genuine sense. Anyway, you got a brick company, and they are being fined. They have railings, but we're in exposed places, you know, above the shop floor, but their railings are only 40 inches high instead of 42 inches high. That's $7,500. They failed to have a sign saying poison on a shed. The shed contained beach sand. But in the list of poisonous substances, OSHA, in its infinite wisdom, has decided beach sand is a poison because in certain grinding operations, it can cause, perhaps, certain kinds of respiratory problems, none of which apply to the brick company. They are told to replace their entire conveyor belt system so it has an automatic shutoff at many thousands of dollars of cost, even though the conveyor belt is already partitioned off from access to people and there's no problem to be done. The OSHA is not going to try for jail time. if people ignore those regulations. And part of the Madison Fund that I'm talking about, well, a key part of it is that it will reimburse people who are fined. And my friend Steve Williams, Judge Emeritus on the Court of Appeals, D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, who's not here tonight, but was really helpful. I asked him, is that legal to reimburse people for these? And he got back to me with, not always it's not going to be, but a lot, it will have to be litigated, but most of the time it is legal to reimburse these things. So people can be made whole in terms of that. They are going to have the hassle of sort of having this legal action done on their behalf, and that's not trivial, but they're not going to end up with a bill.
But what if, if I have my 40-inch railing, which is obviously a sign of anarchy, and the state says I have to raise it to 42 inches, they fine me. I was under the impression that the fine was also in conjunction with an order to raise it 2 inches.
Yeah.
If I refuse to raise it 2 inches, and they say, dude, you really got to raise this 2 inches, and I keep refusing it, don't at some point men with guns come to my house and say you're in trouble?
Let's go to the ultimate aspect of your question. Do you have to have people who are willing to go to jail if it comes to that? And the answer is yes, you do. Then the question is, do we have such people? I don't know for sure that the answer is yes. I get the sense that there are. The certainty of jail, that's a tougher thing. The possibility of jail, I think there are a lot of people who are willing to do that. We will find out, I suppose. But the degree of anger out there, real anger at the way the government is getting in their face when the government doesn't have any business doing there, it's real. You have a lot of really pissed off people.
I feel I have to get the gushing out first. That way we can focus on the book. I don't know that there's anyone on this mortal coil whose writing and thinking has influenced me more than you. So this is truly an honor for me, and I just have to get that out right at the beginning.
I just hope I haven't misled you.
It's pretty clear from all the reading of yours that I've done, you put education basically is number one, right? I mean, is that the number one thing that you can do as a human being? Get educated?
I guess, although I wouldn't carry it too far, because some of the most disastrous notions in the world have come from highly educated people with, I'm sure, high IQs.
So perhaps critical thinking with a little education.
Oh. I will settle for almost any kind of thinking. It's so rare these days.
It is oddly rare. So one of the things that I found out that was sort of amazing about your history, you briefly mentioned it right before we started, you were a Marxist at one time in your life. Most people will find this hard to believe, but it is true.
But it's not that unusual. Most of the leading conservative thinkers of our time did not start off as conservative. You had a couple like Bill Buckley and George Will, but I mean Milton Friedman was a liberal and a Keynesian. Hayek was a socialist. Ronald Reagan was so far left at one point the FBI was following him. You know, so there's a huge movement from the left to the right as people get older.
Yeah, I'm well aware, as I mentioned to you earlier, as a former progressive, I understand that movement in the modern sense. Do you remember sort of what you were thinking, what appealed to you at that time about Marxism?
Yes, I mean, there was no alternative being discussed. My first job was as a Western Union messenger. And I would come home on some nights, I would take the Fifth Avenue bus, which cost all of 15 cents in those days. But I figured I'd splurge now and then. And I would drive, it would go all the way up Fifth Avenue, past all these Lord and Taylor and all these fancy places. And then I would cross 57th Street past Carnegie Hall and down Riverside Drive, and that was sort of the Gold Coast area. And then as I came across this long viaduct, and that turned into 135th Street. Suddenly, there were the tenements, and I wondered, why is this? I mean, it's so different, and nothing in the schools or most of the books seem to deal with that. And Marx dealt with that. So it's like winning an election when there's only one person running.
So then what was your wake-up to what was wrong with that line of thinking?
Facts. Well, you know,
we could probably end the interview right there.
Yeah,
Facts, there you go.
And specifically, my first professional job, I was a summer intern at the U.S. Department of Labor. And I realized from dealing with these people that the U.S. Department of Labor, one of my biggest concerns was about minimum wages. It has been for a long time. And so at first I thought, well, this is good because all these people are poor and they'll get a little higher income, and so that'll be helpful. And then as I studied economics, I began to see, well, there's a downside. They may lose their jobs completely. So that is that. And so when I was at the Labor Department, I tried to talk about that to them, and eventually I came up with some test of it. And when I came up with this test, how we might test this, I was waiting to hear congratulations, you see, that I had this. And I could see these people were stunned. They said, oh, this idiot has stumbled on something that will ruin us all.
Wow.
You know? And I realized the U.S. Department of Labor had its own agenda and interests. And that did not necessarily mean that whether poor people lost their jobs for minimum wages or got higher pay was their highest priority.
Yeah. How much longer did you last at the department?
That was really the turning point.
Yeah.
And then I began to see that all these government agencies and whatnot, they have their own institutional incentives. And you cannot say that the government will step in and do what's right for these people and whatnot, because they'll do what's right for themselves.
So I think a lot of people watching this, and I know because I've been so open about my own sort of awakening, are going through this right now. They're realizing that the things that they've been taught for so long are not the truth and are not based in fact. When that happened to you and you started telling other people, not just the people you were working with, be it family or friends, what kind of pushback did you get? Because it was sort of radical ideas in a way that you were talking about then.
Well, I didn't feel any need to do a lot of proselytizing. It was enough for me that I was now beginning to understand things I hadn't understood before. And as you've noted in the book, I mentioned minimum wage studies, and really they're incredibly flawed. There's a whole chapter on numbers. And the other thing, getting back to my personal development, I mean, I left home when I was 17, no high school diploma, no skills, no job experience. And I discovered that there was not a huge amount of demand for people like that. But in retrospect, decades later when I do research, I realize that in 1948, the unemployment rate for black 16 and 17-year-olds was 9.4. For whites the same age, it was 10.2. And those numbers are much smaller than we're used to in recent decades. And there's no serious racial difference. In fact, the blacks at my age bracket, we're doing just slightly better. And of course, one of the things that the minimum wage law does is that it creates unemployment, raises it to multiples of what it was. 1948 was a special time because the minimum wage law was passed in 1938. And in the intervening 10 years, there was huge inflation, and the law hadn't gotten changed. And so for all practical purposes, there was no minimum wage law. But had we had these wonderful liberals insisting that I be paid a living wage that would support a family of 4, I would have been unemployed.
The resolution: we should move towards privatization, including the schools. Speaking for privatization is Foreign Line host William F. Buckley, Jr., Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, and economist Thomas Sowell, both senior research fellows at the Hoover Institute, Stanford University.
Mr. Buckley, one of the benefits is private choice, but one of the problems with choice, especially in a democracy, is that public schools and private schools have always tried to open doors for students, to give them something their families might not be able to give them on their own. And if you have a system that magnifies or accelerates the differences in this society right now, which increases those differences by allowing pure choice, by allowing marketing to individual interest, Where are we going to be assured that somebody is responsible for transmitting some sense of common values, for the glue that holds us together, what this democracy is all about? How do we assure that we don't just fragment?
To tell you the truth, Mr. Honig, I see a lot of hypocrisy in the position about the public schools as publicly expressed by, for instance, representatives of the NEA. Let's take a recent example, shall we? They always say, well, religion is something that should be taken care of at home. Under the circumstances, it has no place in the classroom. Then a few weeks, months, years go by, and they say, now, of course, there's a thing called sex education. Sex education isn't being taken care of at home, so we got to take care of it here. 60 Minutes last Sunday was full of the responsibilities of public education to teach 13-year-olds how not to become pregnant on the grounds that it wasn't being taught at home. So really, what the philosophers of public education are saying to us is, we want to teach people what we're really interested in. We're not interested in religion. We couldn't care less whether they get religion back home. But we are interested in sex education, so we'll teach them that. I say, let us remember that the parents ought to remain dominant in these matters, and that it is they who ought to be able to select those schools that transmit those values concerning which they feel most ardently.
Well, let me respond as one educator with a very definite philosophy, and that philosophy is that the schools are responsible for transmitting our basic beliefs and values in this country, and that is one. Let me finish, please. And that is one of our objectives. And the question is, how effectively do we do that? We think that the role of religion in the creation of this country, the biblical tradition, all of that should be studied in school.
If you're telling me that we suffer in America from the notion that there is no academic responsibility to forward values, then I welcome your reiteration of the thesis of a book I wrote 35 years ago called The Superstitions of Academic Freedom, in which I pointed out that the notion that a teacher shouldn't say that the Declaration of Independence is a superior document to Marx's manifesto, because academic freedom takes the position that no positions are finally validated, is simply incorrect. But we live in a pluralist society, and people have a right to search out schools that seek to forward their values, and Mr. Sowell and I want to make this mechanically possible.
Fine, but we don't have to pay for it.
Let me emphasize that those of us who want to privatize, who want to have public institutions be controlled by their customers rather than by the politicians. We all want public institutions, and I insist the real issue is government versus private, not public versus private. Those of us who want the institutions that serve the public to be controlled by the customers are not in any way suggesting that the people who work for government institutions are lazy, inefficient, bad, or anything like that. It is not a criticism of the people. It's a criticism of the system. Someone came up to me in the intermission and said, I was a postal worker for 30 years. I worked hard. Of course he did. The individual postal workers, many of them, I won't say all of them, it's not true in private business either that all of them, but the great bulk of individual government employees are doing their very best to do their job. But the institutional arrangements under which they work make it impossible for them to do a good job. It's the system that's at fault, not the people. You had a dramatic example of this recently in Britain, where a government-owned trucking company, a transport company, was privatized, in this case by having the workers buy it, by a buyout, what we call a private buyout. That company had been losing heavily before. It is now making a very fine profit, and the shares in that company have something like quadrupled or quintupled. The same people, but the incentives were very different in operating. So I do not mean to criticize school teachers or postal service employees. On the contrary, what I want to do is to have a system under which they can do their job. I have had any number of school teachers who have complained that with the kind of administrative guidance they get from Mr. Honig and his fellow civil servants, it is very difficult for them to do their job. If you look at the record, the number of administrators in government schools has been going up much more rapidly than the number of teachers. The total amount of money being... the total amount of money being spent on schools has doubled, on government schools has doubled over the past 20 years per capita. The biggest increase in that has been for administration, not for teaching. But let's not divert the issue. The crucial issue is, shall parents, especially those in the lower and middle income classes, have the same opportunity to choose the schools to which their children go that we in the upper and middle income classes have? That's the crucial question. And to that answer, it seems to me you must say yes, and I believe personally that you must say yes to private and religious schools as well. Mr. Honig raises the question, shall the schools transmit values? No. The values of this country, of my country, of your country, has been formed by the people who occupied it, not by school administrators, not by educationists, not by the... We as parents should transmit values to our children. And we as parents, as citizens of our country, should in our political and ordinary activities, one with another, jointly form our values. That's what's made this country great. There wasn't any set of values dictated to the original occupants of this country. There wasn't any such simple set of values dictated to people of my generation or my parents' generation who were immigrants into this country or first-generation children. We got our values largely at home, at the school, and elsewhere. Schools transmit values, but we don't want a monopoly on the transmission of values. We don't want any small group of officials to have the power to say what values shall be transmitted. And yet that is what is happening now in a monopoly school system, and particularly as that school system has gotten more and more centralized. It used to be much better when you had local control of schools, because then you could have variety, diversity. But as the control of schools has moved from the local district to the city, from the city to the state, and from the state to the federal government, increasingly, the values that are being dictated are being determined by an increasingly unrepresentative selection of the population.